Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Tuesday talk. Thank you to Grandmother's Voice for providing this platform where we can gather and meet with friends from all over the place. We're a little bit delayed getting started today. One of our participants, Wendy, was having some audio issues, and I was hoping to have that resolved, but we will work on that in the meantime and get this conversation started. So for those of you who haven't joined before, my name is Andrea. I am the Director of Sustainable Environments for Halton Environmental Network, and love to talk about all things garden and garden related. So welcome to everyone to today's conversation. And we have a new face in the conversation. Leslie, I will just get you to introduce yourself and welcome to today's talk.
Thank you. So my name's Leslie Adams. I live in Halton Hills. I'm here with the Sierra Club Canada Foundation. I am their Biodiversity and Sustainable Development Goals campaigner. So sounds like a fancy title, but it's really giving me a space to enable the work I think is really critical. And from a gardening perspective, lots to say, but I was involved with Protect Our Water environmental resources for years and years, and this is how I got into all this other stuff. But we actually have a community garden in Acton. So, so I'll just leave it at that. Lots I could say, but I'll stop there.
All right, Kevin.
Yep. Kevin Hamilton, an organic farmer for over 20 years. I currently work at McQueston Urban Farm, which is run by Nawasa in east end of Hamilton. We've got a couple acres of gardens, and I'm also saving seed and gardening and farming in other spaces too. I'm glad to be here.
Amazing. And Wendy, so glad you could join us today. I'm so sorry I kicked you out earlier trying to solve your audio problem, but hopefully they're fixed now.
I believe they are. Can you hear me?
They are fixed. Wonderful. Welcome back.
Thank you very much. So I'm with Sustainable Milton, an organization in Milton. And our goal is to make our town a more sustainable community. I've done some work with Leslie, and she's led me down a few paths that I've been delighted to follow her. We really are trying to green our town with native plants and educate folks.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So today's topic is about biodiversity, and I liked how you had that in your summary document, Leslie, capital B and capital D for diversity. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the word, it is, what do they call this? A compound word, biological and diversity mushed together. Now we've got biodiversity. So a change from a single crop or growing just one thing and looking at having lots of diversity for all of these wonderful reasons. So Leslie, why don't you get us started on why this topic is so important to you? What brought you into this sphere of wanting to talk about biodiversity?
That's a big question.
Yeah, well,
and I'll try to keep it very brief because I've been I can talk a lot, so I will not do that. So but I stumbled through, Wendy, kick me, if you need to. So I've been involved indirectly with the international agenda since about 1987. And when the Earth Summit happened in 92, I nearly went, but I didn't. Fast forward to, we wound up moving from Quebec to from Montreal to here in about 1996, and I got involved with power and wound up at the international level participating in Convention on the Commission for Sustainable Development, and got very much involved with the Convention on Biological Diversity. So when I go down this road of biodiversity, what I use is the understanding from the Convention on Biodiversity, the original CBD, CBD, now you Google it and you get cannabinoid oil, but this is really where CBD, that's my CBD. And so what they talk about is genes and genetic diversity, species, all species of which we are one, and ecosystems and the goods and services they give us. So within that big bucket, biodiversity is critical, species diversity and ecosystem function, those components are really critical for food and agriculture. So in the portfolio at the international level, we have agriculture is one of the things you're always looking at with other United Nations groups and that too. So we also have a set of goals and targets internationally, nationally, that they're all kind of nested into each other. Everything kind of goes together. We have a provincial set, and we also have a Halton biodiversity strategy that the region had put in place. It's modest, but it's a beginning. So for me, when I think of biodiversity, it's really about the solutions to what ails us, as opposed to climate change, which is really not understanding that we are a part of, not apart from nature. So biodiversity in food, just think of pollinators and where all that service comes from. If you think of the multiplicity of crops, what we eat and traditionally grow, it's only a fraction of the species that you could eat, I guess, or grow. Mm-hmm. And we also are using a very narrow amount of those species. So the more diversity, heirloom crops, organics, there's just like, it's a plethora. I'll just leave it at that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you've touched on some of the things that we've talked about over the last few weeks, but we always come back to the need to save our own seeds, and just the abundance of diversity and flavors and colors and shapes. Even tomatoes, looking at 800 varieties. Well, how many do we see in the grocery store? A handful of them. And how much flavor that we could be missing out on without this ability to save our own seeds and grow a diverse assortment of crops. Yeah. Kevin, anything you want to jump in on, or Wendy? We'll make sure everybody has an opportunity to contribute. Yep. Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about biodiversity, I don't want to go down the dark road or the negative topic, but I know I've seen for the first time in 20 years ago, Monsanto had a goal to own the seed banks and have 80% of the vegetable seed their products, and I really saw that come to fruition this year. So the loss of that biodiversity in the plant breeding program brings us to what I want to do is the amount of backyard gardeners that have kept biodiversity alive can't be understated. They've kept all kinds of beautiful lineage of the dark tomatoes around, and all these old ones that you read about at the turn of the century in the Berkey seed catalog and that. So important to keep your diversity in your own gardens, to keep different flowers and herbs and plants and all that kind of stuff. And I was reminded to some on the weekend there with Terry Lynn Brandt about the respect and reverence we should have for the indigenous species of plants that grew in this bioregion, and helping to protect them too. There's a lot of being able to facilitate and create conditions in our soils and take those indigenous plants and stuff so that they can grow and go to seed and repopulate, I think is really important. But having said that, we do live in a very globally diverse world. I would say 80% or more of the weeds we have in our garden are not native to here. The purslane, the pigweeds, the lamb's quarters, they've all been brought over from different crops and food things that we've put in. Yes, I might ramble on. I too am long in the tooth, like you said there, Leslie. But yeah, recognizing that we need to keep our native plant species alive and well, and continue to maintain that diversity. And as backyard gardeners, we have a big responsibility and help in that regard.
Mm-hmm. So Wendy, what does the topic of biodiversity mean to you? What do you think of when you hear these words, or what significance does it have for you?
Yeah, for me, it has the significance of so much more choice, so much more diversity, so much more growth. And what I find really interesting is the last 2 months, even being part of this group and then working with Terry Lynn Brandt, one of the Mohawk seakeeper who's helping us. There's been so much learning about, and it's just really broadened my horizon about what's out there and what's possible. And really, I think wanting to communicate, to our colleagues and friends that biodiversity is something that is hugely at risk. And I'm sure Leslie can speak to it in terms of the last decade on biodiversity. And then I think the future one is biodiversity or restoration. And Kevin, I go back to one of our earlier meetings just around your talk about soil and all of the little beasts that can be in just a handful of soil. And how do we make sure that we do the right thing to protect them? So, I think of pollinators. I think of, and it's just been in the last couple of years, is that planting with pollinators and with vegetables, and really looking. I never knew there were so many types of tomatoes or so many types of cabbages. So I think backyard gardening is really coming back more than it's ever been, or maybe since post-war. And I'm hoping at some point, Leslie can talk to us a little bit about Sierra Club, but I need to know a lot more about biodiversity, but the learning curve is steep, but I think it's critical to our survival.
Mm-hmm. So Leslie, do you want to jump back in there? That seemed like a door wide open to pass it back over to you.
So we're part of a system, right? Everything works together. We're not above other life on Earth. We're not above Earth. We're a part of it. So Dorothy Taylor, has taught me this idea. So this idea of stewardship of nature is not something I'm really part of. I'm more in kinship with nature. So instead of being anthropocentric and seeing us as apart, I'm really into being ecocentric. And there's a whole, if you want to go down that road, there's a huge amount of information about just being a part of the system. So when I'm looking at plants and we're looking at things you can eat, or looking at how those things get to be and how they get to be a seed and how they get to grow and the little bit of water they need and the soil health that's involved and all those species, the millions of different species. Microbes are part of biodiversity. Cancer is part of biodiversity. It is a part of it too. It's something that has evolved, and maybe we don't like it particularly, but it is not living the way in sentient, but it is alive. So when I think of the role of insects, so you guys have probably seen when I was a kid and we would drive to the country, the amount of insects on your windshield constantly was huge. It was like, oh my God, what are you going to do with that? And you look now, and there is nearly none. You might get a batch of mayflies, you get some closer to the water, but what does that mean? As we're ripping apart and ripping out from the bottom up, it's like when they fish in the ocean and we've eaten all the top fish. Now we're eating lower on the food chain, and you're getting lower and lower. And as you destroy under the underpinnings of the food chain, not just for us, for all life, what does that mean? So as we lose insects and chemicals like genetically modified organisms is huge. The idea of using pesticides to kill everything but what you're trying to grow is a huge issue, and it kills all the other life. So just for a kick at the CBD, so I would like everyone to be involved with the convention work, particularly. But we have a protocol. So you guys are familiar with climate change. So the Convention on Biodiversity is one of the three sisters of the Earth Summit. The other two multilateral agreements are climate change, Convention on Biodiversity, and there's the Convention to Combat Desertification. And within the climate change convention, you have the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Accord, blah, 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 blah. Within the CBD, the Convention on Biodiversity, we have the Cartagena Protocol, which is actually dealing with living modified organisms and genetically manipulated things. So that's a big part. And we in Canada don't realize the role of the this within what we do. So I do a bunch of stuff on living modified organisms too. But we also have the Nagoya Protocol for Indigenous participation. So the whole idea of Nagoya is that from an Indigenous lens, you're not allowing, you're not sharing the benefits arising out of biodiversity fairly, aka multinational corporations can take the knowledge without not monetary compensation, but recognizing this abundance of knowledge that Indigenous people have and where it comes from. So coming down from that, you're up here and just trying to come down to the local level. Sierra Club has been around for like 50 years. It's 50 years old. It has a sister organization in the United States. So Sierra Club was founded by Muir in the 1890 or whatever in the States. So, and they're very advocacy related in the States. Canada's not so much. We have a Sierra Club in Ontario, all those things too. But locally with Sierra Club, we're starting a small chapter here, but there's a Peel chapter too. So it's this idea, it's kind of like this environmental collective idea, but it's more Sierra Club is a space to be able to bring the issues broader and to also tap into what's going on across the country. So I do the conservation work nationally, but I do a lot of work provincially, but I also work with the other chapters in other parts of the country. And if you come back to food again, so this, what you guys are doing around food and in your backyard. So we will again, a project with biodiversity in your backyard. So when you're growing all these wonderful plants and feeding wonderful things and sharing, building community around food, the idea of wilding a small corner for species that you might not always think about, the idea of having a biodiversity corridor between backyards. My backyard faces your backyard, and maybe we can take a foot on either side and just populate that with native plants. So I'm hoping that people out there are doing, when they're gardening for food, they're also thinking about the relationship to other living things. So I have personally started, teeny tiny right now, a small rare native plant nursery. So I have 8 different species of milkweed. I have 5 different species of liatris. I have ironweed and fireweed and buttonbush and New Jersey tea. So these are all plants that are generally pollinator or bird plants, but they're also this idea of, we're talking about food, but if you go to a nursery, everything you're buying is probably grown with lots of fertilizers and probably pesticides, and you're putting them in your backyard to attract pollinators, and they might not be the right plant, but they also might be doing more damage. So this idea of an ecological trap for pollinators, where they come and spend a whole bunch of time on a plant that looks real pretty, but it's like me eating a lot of popcorn, but not eating my celery, right? It's like junk food for them sometimes. So I hope people out there, I challenge everyone, I guess, to find one rare native plant or maybe it's a little bit of milkweed or some liatris, but a native species of the plant, not a cultivar, it's like an heirloom local native species as opposed to cultivars that aren't as beneficial. But yeah, like I'd love to. So borage, I know borage. So Kevin, borage is edible, isn't it? Yeah. So
Yeah, I generally were just eating flowers. I'm not sure culinarily what you can do with the leaves, but I'm sure it's edible.
so because I know borage might not be a native, but it's a really beneficial plant and it's really pretty, right? So anise hyssop is an anise, which winds up having that anise is licoricey. That's the word I'm looking for. So a lot of the native plants, I know last time you guys got into talking about nettles and things like that, and I was sitting in the background going, go stinging nettle. Like that's really an awesome plant for pollinators, and it's really a good thing to have in your garden. But a lot of the native ones have a food benefit too. And if you get into the indigenous side of it, all those, the ethnobotany and looking at what cultural traditions for food on the landscape, things we might not really want to even consider because it didn't come out of the grocery store, are things you can incorporate into your local food system or your backyard garden. And so I'm a big, can't say I eat a lot of them now, but I'm starting to explore that. So I'm not a forager. I don't want to go and take stuff out of the woods because if everyone's foraging, there's nothing left. It's like harvesting local seed. If I harvest too much, there's nothing left, right? You have to be cautious. But I'm kind of in a circle here. So Andrea.
All right. So why don't we pick one of those jumping off points? Kevin, was there anything in that you want to explore further, and keeping in mind our overarching themes of food security, food sovereignty, and survival for both us, the world around us, the planet?
Absolutely. You touched on a lot of things there, Leslie. I think the underpinnings of everything that you said is the soil under our feet. So when we're tilling, when we're breaking up soil, when we're breaking it apart, all that, we're killing all the fungus and microorganisms and all that. And the desertification you were talking about as one of the three sisters there for essential and biodiversity is we are microbially bankrupt in our soils. And so when we till, you have a bacterially dominant soil, and it is going to grow those noxious weeds that we don't necessarily like, or we think of as noxious because we don't understand the virtues of those weeds. Getting that biodiversity back in our soil is the key. So like when I look out at the ethnobotanically speaking, when I look at all the weeds and stuff that are out there that weren't necessarily native to here, and then when you look into the soil too, I used to think, because I was growing organisms or microorganisms that were being shipped in from predominantly from Asia and putting in our soil, and through the soil experts that I've and the botanists and stuff that I've talked with, I was worried about putting foreign microorganisms in our soil, but lo and behold, having them done studies and looked at things, when you create the conditions, it's the same with our guts for food security, for our own health, and that when you're drinking too much pop or coffee or alcohol or processed sugars and anything in packaging, it's void of living micronutrients in that and enzymes, and you create those conditions in your gut, which we currently have an 80% difference in. We're creating all the yeasty bad bacterias where we don't have all the mycoflora and all the good stuff in our gastrointestinal tracts to help us absorb nutrients and break them apart and make them readily available for our bodies. So when we change our constitution, both in the soil and in our guts, you start to create the conditions where, like Michael Schmidt, the raw milk farmer, he took the raw milk, he put all the bad pathogens and all the things that they're so worried about, and he put it in the milk, and then 2 days later he tested the milk, and lo and behold, they were not there because they weren't in conditions that help them, that are conducive for their growth. So tumors and cancer and all those bad things grow in our acidic bodies when we're having too much of that processed stuff and we don't have good fermented, live cultured foods going into our bodies. And the same thing with the soil. When we're able to bring in these maybe external indigenous microorganisms from Asia or Europe or whatever, when we put them in our soils, the indigenous microorganisms that are there, the conditions are created then for them to flourish. And so, there's two ways to look at it. I think like we're at a point in humanity where we have this global food, like the earth that has native, not indigenous weeds and foods and everything that we've transported here. It's trying to create the conditions for all of those to thrive, but I think the indigenous things that have been here forever, they're the ones that when the soil changes and the microbes are good, it will grow all those good things. That's what I'm kind of thinking. But I know like in perennials, the more perennials we can eat, the more perennials we can plant. That is going to create those perennial conditions where we're not constantly turning the soil. So like linden tree, I know that's not a native tree to here too, but that is your summer romaine. So you can eat the leaves from a linden tree, and that's like romaine lettuce. And starting to figure out what those plants are, whether they've been introduced or not, that we can, because like I think the annual foods that we grow are broccolis, are tomatoes, are most of the foods that we find in the grocery store are annual. And I think that kind of goes to how our thinking is. If we're eating only annual plants that we have to reintroduce, start from seed every single year, then what does that do to our long-term thinking? If we're eating more perennial stuff that has that deep nutrition from the denser minerals because it's been in the soil with the fungi making all those minerals and stuff available, then I think we'll have a much better long-term vision and think more along the lines of 7 generations.
Mm-hmm. Interesting point of view. Yeah, thinking about annual crops versus perennial crops, and yeah, just having that long-term viewpoint of how is this plant going to survive for the next 10, 20 years, and I'm going to receive some benefit from it, but I need to take care of it for those for that duration, as opposed to carrots or just the annual crops where you just want as much as you can get as quick as possible, and then come what may to that soil.
Yeah, I think that's a big advantage to the backyard gardeners too, because if I'm growing food for profit, I'm stuck in this paradigm because the eaters want all that, and I don't necessarily want to grow it, but I'm handcuffed into how do I provide for my family and that kind of thing. So the backyard gardeners, if you can make a relation with a local farmer or a local landholder, because there's all these people that have money that bought these farms that aren't, and they're just letting GMO whatever crop out. If you can get an acre and make that your acre and try and get like a 10-year lease or something, if you're a gardener and we all live 20 minutes from agricultural zones, that's a great strategy to start growing those perennials and making this beautiful plot that you can take care of on the microbial level and the above ground too.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to say, so fruit trees are a good example of that, Kevin? So if you're looking at a tree, if you're eating fruit from a tree or even a strawberry, so our fruits tend to be more perennial than our vegetables. So peppers are a perennial plant, but not in our climate. I bring my hot peppers in and out all the time. But even tomatoes, I think, are maybe a little bit longer than an annual generally, if you're looking at, I'm not sure about it, but our fruits tend to be perennial more than our veggies. So, and I just wanted to make, so I don't know. I'd love to know what the perennial veggies are, but I'm also curious. So this idea of ecosystem within ourselves. So we live in a big biosphere that's an ecosystem, but it comes right down to a puddle or a body. So we are our own complete functional ecosystems within us. So like it's scalable on all these different levels. But Chantal Garneau, I don't know, she does a lot of work on your internal ecosystem, not from a food perspective to some degree, but more from a interplay between mental health issues and your gut biome and how all that kind of goes all together. So it's another angle on what you were saying, though. For
It's
me,
that
yeah,
a great letter word, eco-immunonutrition.
correct.
So eco, ecology, immuno, it's your immune system, and nutrition, you're feeding your immune system with the ecology that's breaking it all down. And that's a Sandor Katz. I coined that phrase from him. But yeah.
So I wanted to, so Kevin, kind of jumping off from your point about, an acre. And I'm thinking of the garden we have or are working on up at Grandmother's Voice and with Terry Lynn Brandt this past weekend. And I know we were looking at some cover crop, and then Terry Lynn suggested we actually look at indigenous grasses to plant when we're not using that part of the field. So we're doing some research about that. But I think it's something that we need to, I think, turn our minds to more often about, rather than going to what might be the usual fallback position, what else is out there that we don't know about, but other people do. So I don't know if anybody has any suggestions about what kind of grasses. And Leslie, I was thinking of our friend Stefan and the land that we have, or that there is at Country Heritage Park, whether even that's Stefan Weber also does the native seed preservation, and I think has made that his mission. And so I thought I'd reach out to him to see what kind of grasses he might recommend we use as a cover crop at Grandmother's Voice.
So I think legumes are good. So I think Kevin's going to correct me probably, or maybe. But so Stefan runs the Ontario Plant Restoration Alliance. He's a seed collector. He's the one who got me down this road of got to save the rare native plants. He's miraculous and incredible. But I think for soil and to help nutrients within soil, if you're not using it, I think some of the principles of legumes and those types of guys are really good. And we have some native legumes we might not necessarily know about, but if you're holding soil for future use, I think legumes are really good. I know the grasses are really good. So I have lead plant and fireweed, which the roots on them, actually borage too. If you look at the root of borage, the little babies I've got are like, maybe an inch tall, but the root is like this long. And all that root is grabbing those nutrients from deeper down, but it's also sequestering the carbon at the same time. So I think maybe considering native legumes might be useful, but and grasses, I don't know as much. I know legumes are really good at making the soil healthier, but I think.
And the grasses, I think what Terry Lynn's point was bringing the nutrients from those deep grass roots, and then the biomass. Remember, she was talking about the chop and drop method of pruning and weeding. That's really what the grasses are excellent at doing, is adding that biomass back into the soil, which sequesters the carbon. And it also enriches it as it decomposes it. So grasses do have a large part in the conversation. We are going to wrap things up shortly. So are there any closing remarks that anybody would like to have about biodiversity and food security, food sovereignty? We haven't really touched on the food sovereignty much in this conversation, but we may have to have a part 2.
Well, yeah, saving your seeds from your favorite plants, and there's the sovereign part.
True.
One thing I would say, it's great to plant the native grasses and that. I, as a farmer, have always been a much bigger fan of the cocktail crop. So you'll have your grasses in there, plus the legumes, plus whatever things you're looking for, or whatever things you think your soil. And if you're making good compost, like pure bio, like real biocomplete compost, and getting it up to temperature and ensuring that there's moisture. The moisture is key. Like everything needs to have moisture, and it's as easy as picking up, squeezing your compost, and make sure that 2 or 3 drops come out as opposed to a lot, and keeping it moist. That's one great way. Once you have that biocomplete compost and you put it in the soils, it starts to break down, and lettuce has been proven to have like 15-20 foot roots too, even though we associate it with shallow roots. When you get the microbes in the soil and create the conditions, everything drops down and brings it back up, and nutrients are available. We have 100,000 years of fertility in all our soils if the microbes are there doing their job, recycling, and that involves covering the earth and that kind of thing.
All comes back to how we care for the earth, doesn't it? Yeah. Leslie?
And
ourselves, absolutely.
And the ecosystems and everything around us. So I'm going to make, so I think the food sovereignty nuance from security and sovereignty are kind of part and parcel of the same thing, and a little bit of space inside your house. I think the idea of preserving and understanding how much you really need is a whole other angle. So I mean, I've grown lots of stuff, and then all of a sudden you've got so much you don't know what to do with it. So now I'm trying to, for myself, not go. The native plants is insane right now. Like I've got probably 4,000 things growing out front, right? It's just insane. But the fruits and veggies particularly, I didn't grow the whole pack of seeds this year. I grew a handful. I started Thai chili from a plant from a Thai chili pepper that I ate. So, and just a few, right? And I've got some to give away, and some people will be beneficiary of it too. But from a biodiversity side, so we're from 2011 to 2020 was the decade on biodiversity. And we had I'm going to put this up here for a second. This was the strategic plan for biodiversity from 2011 to 2020. Right now, we're in the process of negotiating the next international agreement, which flows down into the national. And we're starting our Ontario biodiversity strategy right now. We're starting to convene around what will that look like. So because really this should have been done, I shouldn't be able to talk to you about this. But I just wanted to underscore, so in this one, the international one, there's all sorts of things to do with agriculture within this. But I wanted to go to the strategic goal C, improve the status of biodiversity by safeguarding ecosystems, species, and genetic diversity. So in there, target 13 was by 2020, the genetic diversity of cultivated plants and farmed and domesticated animals and of wild relatives. So we haven't even had that conversation, including other socioeconomically as well as culturally valuable, so that gets into the ethnobotany, species is maintained, and strategies have been developed and implemented for minimizing genetic erosion and safeguarding their genetic diversity. So this is something, so for me, I pull these things and bring them down here, and then you go and talk to the region or talk to Ontario Federation of Agriculture or whoever it might be, but trying to get people all walking down the same path. So we're preserving and protecting our biodiversity. And I love the soil stuff. Like I don't know enough about soil, but I know it's foundational. Ha ha.
Amazing. We always like to end on a good pun or wordplay. So this is National Compost Awareness Week. So let's dig in and use some of that compost in our gardens, or maybe no-till. I don't know. We'll just add it into our soil, add it into our talk. Lovely to meet you, Leslie. Wendy, any closing comments or remarks? Kevin, good to see you're not sideways. I thought maybe you were sleeping on the job there. Not sure what happened to your camera.
Ooh.
There we go. Yeah, it happens. Wendy, any final closing remarks?
I know Leslie had asked about some of the perennial vegetables, and I'd like to know more about those too. I'm happy to say I got some great asparagus stalks yesterday, and I've put them in my garden, and hopefully, and I wrapped the wire around so my chickens don't get them. So hopefully some fresh asparagus soon. So thank you very much. This has been really, really a fun chat. Thank you.
Wonderful. Kevin?
Thanks. I really enjoyed as well.
All right. Have a wonderful week, everyone. We will continue this conversation. We'll do some research on perennial veggie crops and see what we can talk about in our ongoing conversations together.
And I'll try and prepare a song for next week. I do have.
Oh, yes. I'm sure Jody's listening.
Yeah. Anyways.
Close this out, Kevin. Come on.
Next week
Thank
for sure.
you.
Have a good week, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.